Dear Ben and Moby, sometimes when I give instructions or explanations, I notice students staring at me as if I were speaking Chinese. I really want to use real English when I speak to them, but I also need them to understand what I'm saying. How do I help them understand me? From an English language teacher. As English language teachers, our aim is to become more aware of the complexity of language we use and messages we give in class, and to make informed choices as to appropriate teacher classroom language. In short, we need to improve our second language sensitivity. One of the best ways that we can address this teacher talk issue is to use graded language when we speak to our students. You don't want to speak to the whole class the same way you do with groups, pairs, or individual students. We must use judgment and discernment to level language properly. Try and think of your teacher talk like a pyramid. You wouldn't jump right into teaching students how to debate if they don't have discussion skills, or conversation skills, or instructional English, or classroom language. You got to start with a strong foundation and then build from there. Now that you know you need to grade your language, the question is, how? There are a number of aspects of language that the teacher can grade when speaking to the class. You might choose to grade none, one, some, or all of these suggestions. It's really up to you. No one knows your students better than you do. The first and one of the most important things to consider when grading your language is grammar and lexical usage. Restrict language to those items below a certain perceived level of difficulty. For example, by avoiding any grammatical or lexical items that have not yet been covered in the learner's coursebook. My rule of thumb is keep the tenses the same and use forms that you've already covered. The sounds that you make are another big thing that you need to think about when you're grading your teacher talk. You want to avoid listening difficulties that might be caused by pronunciation features you don't even think about. For example, saying, "What do you want?" with each word pronounced separately, rather than running them together. For example, "What do you want?" Stress is another important thing to think about. Simplify what is said by stressing important words more strongly. Leave short pauses before and after the stress to aid understanding. For example, "I want you to open your books, please." This is known as punching keywords, and it can be really helpful in a lower level classroom. Next, state information in a logical order, perhaps mirroring the order that students will have to do the things. And you want to use transitional phrases like first, second, third, or next, after that, and then, finally. Try to think of the step-by-step process like instructions from IKEA or a Lego building block set. The next thing to think about is the speed of your delivery. Regardless of the language items used, you've got to match the speed of the language delivery to the level of the classroom. You have to think, are you going to use highly graded speed, a class average, a little above the class average? Are you going to use a challenging speed or ungraded speed, where you talk like a normal native speaker? One of the most important, and in my opinion the hardest part of grading your language, is figuring out the discourse features and noise that you add to your language without even thinking about it. The clarity of what is said can be affected by language used that's not central to the core message. Any noise or unnecessary wrapping around the key message may add comprehension difficulties and lead to confusion. Noise may be words or expressions like, or, well, what I want you to do is, we all know these sort of natural fillers, right? Entire sentences that add nothing to the message and just overload students' cognitive ability and distract from the message that you want to make. So I suggest that you kind of meditate on the language that you will use before you use it. And my last tip for graded language is about complexity and quantity of your message. Basically, you want to break difficult concepts down into smaller, more easily understood pieces. Our aim is to say very brief things and avoid much longer ones. My rule of thumb is I try to keep sentence length nearly the same as the grade level. 4 words per sentence for students in the 4th grade. Okay, now that you know what graded language should sound like, here's an example of different degrees of grading in terms of some of the issues mentioned throughout this video. We want the class to work in pairs and write answers to a grammar exercise. Notice that the shorter graded instructions actually contain more of the useful information. Here's an example of ungraded teacher talk. So could you please, what I wanted you to do was to talk together to do the exercise in pairs. So get together with a partner, could you? And it's on page 22. So, okay, when you've sorted out your pair, make a start on what you've got to do and jot down the answers. All right, everybody got it? Let's get started. Of graded teacher talk. Okay, everyone, I want you to get into pairs. Turn to page 22, do exercise B. Talk together and agree to the answers. And finally, here's an example of highly graded teacher talk. Get into pairs, page 22. Exercise B. Work together. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I decide what level of grading is appropriate? Well, really it's your choice, but it will depend partly on the overall language level of the class. Generally speaking, the lower the level of the class, the more graded your language will be. But remember that with an advanced class, it may well be appropriate and useful if you use ungraded language, at least part of the time. And now it's time for you to reflect on your own teacher talk. Is it as strong as Moby's? Do you vary the grading of language according to levels you teach and stages of a lesson? If so, how? Which elements do you grade most carefully? And in closing, I'd like to share my teacher talk philosophy. In my English language classroom, I want most of the students to understand most of what I'm saying most of the time. That's my barometer for success. How about you?